Psalm 121 is my favorite psalm, and I found myself turning to it many times in the last year. As we emerge from a year and a half of never before experienced time and prepare for a new church year that promises to bring us new life and a back in person life, we asked a cross section of our congregation to share their experiences of life and faith in the year that was. Here are their reflections, and we thank them for sharing.
Pandemics cause changes in our lives. I never imagined that this pandemic would change my prayer life. The lockdown created routines in my life, and one of them was my prayer life. I do not remember how it evolved, but I carved out 2 daily times for prayer. The first one was soon after I got up in the morning. I am an early riser, and I like to go and do my exercises first thing in the morning. I decided that instead of going to the basement for gym time, I would take time to pray. This first prayer time became prayers for our immediate family, our 2 daughters and our son, and their families. I name each one of them one by one and pray for them. I also pray for John and me. Over the months, my words have not changed unless their lives have changed. I continued to repeat the same words over and over and over every morning, knowing that God is there. The second prayer time usually occurs after breakfast. When the pandemic started, the Washington National Cathedral launched a daily devotion time. The cathedral clergy and staff take turns presenting scripture readings, a short meditation, and prayers. I do not remember how I found out about this ministry, but I have been listening to these devotions for months and months and months. After the devotion, I turn to God with my own prayers. I pray for 5 different groups of people in my life on 5 different days. Sometimes I miss a day or 2 of that week. I pray for our extended families, brothers, sisters, cousins, nephews. I pray for people in the joys and concerns. On another day, I pray for families on our block, up and down, 2 sides, both sides. And I pray for other neighbors. I pray for church staff, the deacons, the sessions. I pray for non-church friends. Pandemics changes lives and are not welcomed, but I thank God for the changes in my prayer life.
It's really nice to be able to reflect on how Chevy Chase Presbyterian Church has been such a treasure. I thought I'd start by looking back at when I joined the church almost 20 years ago. And I'll admit that over that period, I had lost a husband, had a couple of brain tumors, and I cannot emphasize enough how helpful and supportive every aspect of the church has been, from clergy visits to the hospital to gifts and calls and cards and meals from fellow members, to just how great the staff has been. So that is my perspective on my entire span and treasured span with the church. I know we're talking about how we've coped in the last year with the pandemic, and I've also had some lows then, some personal lows, including an event that Pastor Molly swept me up into her arms and made sure that we had lunch up near the church, and have once again heard from many people and various phone calls and cards and notes. I also think that the way the church has handled virtual services has been a real highlight, and I think a real jewel. There are some dividends during the COVID, including I think we're communicating more with one another, more purposefully. And I do believe that our services on Zoom have been a highlight of all my years with CCPC. Our pastors have given beautiful sermons. Our kids have participated. Our music director, Julie, has knocked it out of the park with both her organ performances and leading us in song with her gorgeous soprano. And all the other things that we've experienced, kids reading, singing, dancing, performing, and everyone doing their part. So I can only say that as I'm speaking right now in July of 2021, a year and more after we've been shut down, and now that we ideally have all been vaccinated, that I couldn't be more grateful to the church since I was lucky enough to join it almost 20 years ago.
And what are you looking forward to most coming out of COVID?
To actually see people and say, peace be with you, and maybe having the courage to hug them.
Great.
And to my chicks pew. I mean, those those ladies that always join me. I can't wait to basically put the flag down for the next chicks pew that we'll have up front with the Hislops nearby.
Hello, I'm Peter Cherukuri. I want to thank John Cox and Chrissy Schmidt for inviting me and my son Benji to share our journey during COVID with all of you. To start, I'd like to share this quote from the theologian Simone Weil that I discovered last year reading Richard Rohr. Grace fills empty spaces, but it can only enter where there is a void to receive it. The year of COVID was the void that allowed me to experience God's grace. Up until March 2020, I was obsessed with my own needs and desires, traveling on a weekly basis to New York for one job while trying to get my own company off the ground. I formed bad habits on the road that physically and spiritually were not good for me or my family. I was stretched and, in hindsight, ineffective. At the start of COVID, I had to ask myself, who am I if I'm not on the go? It turns out that letting go of being on the go allowed God's grace to flow. By being forced to slow down and witnessing the humbling and terrifying impact of the pandemic, I was able to receive God's love in ways that I never imagined would be possible. There are three ways that I experienced God's grace that I'd like to share with you. Number one, I'm really thirsty for fellowship. As some of you know, we have a men's spirituality group that before COVID physically met at the church on a weekly basis. At the start of quarantine, one of the first things that we did as a group was to decide to meet 2 times per week via Zoom. It was such an effortless, natural decision that we made as a group. That increased frequency made me realize how thirsty I was for spiritual nourishment, and now has set me on a path to deconstruct and reconstruct my faith. But I'm not doing it alone. I'm doing it with the group. Number 2, there's a real ROI on service. I found a new capacity to serve others and found a return on that investment in significant ways. I always thought I didn't have enough time to serve, whether it's to this church or to other organizations. Turns out I always had the time, but I never made it a priority. Now, through our church, in this past year, Danielle and I have become members. We've become deacons. I'm working with Deanna, Christy, and Eric Woodworth on our racial justice review, and now partnering with Mary Frances and others on how to reimagine giving and stewardship. I have found that the more I serve, the more my overall capacity increases. Don't know why that happens, but it's happening. Number 3, home is not a physical structure. It's a mindset. I was terrified of physically being quarantined with Danielle and Benji. I was worried we would fall apart. On top of that, we have an extended family unit of older children and extended family. Instead of falling apart, it only got stronger. Our perspective on how we can create a home wherever our family is became our entire family's perspective. I think the same thing happened with our church. The absence of not being in the sanctuary has been difficult, but I am so grateful for the visible and invisible sacrifice that people have made to create a new spiritual experience and ritual every week on Zoom. It's increased the number of participants that can experience CCPC. And when we go back home to the church, I hope we can all realize and appreciate that it's actually a new home with new ways, physically and virtually, to experience. In sum, I just want to close by saying I used to be terrified about the silence of God. Turns out God is never silent. My ears were just plugged up. Thank you for letting me share.
God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. Now, this is Psalm 46, verses 1, and I think it resembles my life in COVID, as for many people. It was a time where we call on God to help us because we feel like we hit rock bottom and we feel depressed. At least for me. I can't speak for everyone, but I felt depressed. I didn't get to see my friends and family, and I was doing school online and not experiencing those 13 years of school in person, at least for 1 year. And it was rough. But the downside of COVID was that I didn't get to see my friends and family. My grandfather passed away, and it was very depressing and sad. But it's kind of like a blessing in disguise, you know? Because I feel like all these down hits and all these where we feel like we hit rock bottom really bring us together and make us feel like one, especially with my family. I feel like I really got to connect with my mom, my stepdad, my dad, and my stepmom, and because we were staying home, and we were really connecting, and that really brought me joy to know my parents, because usually half of the time we're not really seeing our parents, we're usually seeing our teachers majority, but that kind of flipped. So I'm very grateful, and I feel like that Psalm 46 verses 1 really resembles the struggle during COVID, but we have God to help us get through His strength, give us a push into the right direction.
Good morning. I'm Larry Maxwell. My wife Rebecca and I and our 2 boys have been members at CCPC for many years now. John Cox had reached out to me and asked me to provide a personal narrative on how the pandemic had affected our family and to perhaps highlight a loss and how this might have affected my faith. So unfortunately, I lost my mother to COVID during the pandemic. She, in her latter years, had been challenged with Alzheimer's, was very functional, but was in an assisted living environment, had gotten sick, was transferred to the hospital, and ultimately discharged in not the best shape. Unfortunately, both during the time of her illness and even prior to her illness, was not able to see her in person. So I think this had caused her a great deal of anxiety because of her intermittent dementia, and also created some anxiety on my part because I just didn't feel that connection with her when she was faced with some of these troubling times. One thing that was relevant to her passing was that years ago, Rebecca and I had helped my mom during a troubling time in which she was losing her husband to lung cancer. And when he was discharged to home hospice, we were there with him on his deathbed with my mom. And my mom took a lot of comfort in that she was able to read him a psalm, and he became somewhat alert during those final minutes. And actually, when she finished reading him the psalm, he had a tear roll down his face, and within minutes he died. So when my mother was seemingly getting worse, I had called her and let her know that they had finally given me approval to actually come and see her in person the following morning. But I was concerned at how poorly she was doing, and so I read her a psalm with hopes of giving her some strength. And this is a psalm that during my own times of stress, when I was deployed to Iraq, and even in some of the troubling times I've had as a cancer surgeon, this has been a source of strength for me. So the 18th Psalm is, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge. He is my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." So I was able to read this psalm to her that night over the phone, and it seemed to give her some calmness and peace. And that was the last time I spoke to my mom. And several hours later, they called me and told me she had passed. So I would say during troubling times, oftentimes, how's my faith affected? I usually lean into my faith. And I think that's my own spiritual faith, but I think the pandemic has also led me to have faith in others. I think that a lot of the divisiveness we have within our society, I felt, was left at the door within the confines of my healthcare system. Because no matter how divided we were on views and perspectives in the context of trying to tackle a common mission of supporting our community through the pandemic, everyone came together. So it gave me hope in terms of our community, both regionally and nationally. And again, it strengthens my faith in that I continue to be thankful for what I have and not necessarily what I don't have. So I'm extremely, we were very much adversely affected with the loss of my mom, but the other perspective is that she's not suffering any longer, and she had a pretty peaceful departure, and so for that I'm grateful. But I think that kind of sums up how the pandemic has affected us, and in both a negative and a positive way.